You're listening to the Archetype Effect, conversations redefining power, purpose and leadership for women and the coaches who guide them. I'm Ros Cardinal, leadership coach and creator of the Women's Leader Archetypes. Together we'll explore the real stories, the research and reflections that help women rise with clarity and authentic power. There's a moment many women arrive at in leadership. Often it comes quietly. A moment where you hear yourself in a conversation and you think, that didn't sound like me. Or you realise you've said yes before you'd even checked whether you had capacity. Or you notice yourself pulling away from something you would have leaned into. And something inside you pauses. Not because the situation is unfamiliar, because you are. From the outside, things may still look fine. You're still delivering, still functioning, still relied upon. But internally, something feels different. A little sharper, a little more guarded, a little more responsible for everything, a little less free. And when women describe this to me, they rarely begin with language like shadow or nervous system. They say things like, I don't know what's happened to me. I used to enjoy this. I'm not usually like this. I don't recognise myself lately. And I always listen carefully when I hear that. Because often that sentence is not about one difficult season. It's about a deeper recognition. A recognition that somewhere along the way you learn to protect yourself has started to feel like who you are. In the Women's Leader Archetypes model, we talk about 4 empowered archetypes: the sovereign, the warrior, the wise woman, the tribe builder. And we also talk about their shadow expressions: the hermit, the tyrant, the lone wolf, and the martyr. If some of these archetypes are unfamiliar, you might want to revisit the earlier episodes in Season 1, where we explored these patterns in much more depth. I've linked the Season 1 playlist and the YouTube explainer videos in the show notes. But today isn't about learning the model from scratch. It's about understanding why these patterns can feel so persistent. Why intelligent, capable women can recognise themselves withdrawing, controlling, overfunctioning, or overcarrying, and still feel pulled back into the same response. Because these patterns rarely begin in leadership. They begin much earlier. In the environments that shaped us, children are extraordinarily perceptive. They learn what creates approval, what reduces conflict, what keeps them safe, what helps them belong, and then they adapt. Not because something's wrong with them, because adaptation is intelligent. A child who learns that visibility brings criticism may become very good at staying small. A child who learns that achievement creates approval may become very good at performing competence. A child who learns that others don't understand her inner world may become very good at relying on herself. A child who learns that connection depends on keeping others happy may become very good at smoothing, pleasing, and anticipating people's emotional needs. At some point, these strategies probably worked. They protected something important. And because they worked, the nervous system remembered them. This is the part I want to slow down around. When pressure becomes chronic in adult leadership, we rarely invent entirely new ways of coping. We go back to what feels familiar. Not because it's the best strategy for now, but because it once created safety. That's why these patterns can be so difficult to shift. They're not just behaviours, they're old solutions, old forms of protection. And under enough pressure, they can begin organising how we lead. The hermit shows us what happens when protection looks like withdrawal. The tyrant shows us what happens when protection looks like control. The lone wolf shows us what happens when protection looks like containment. And the martyr shows us what happens when protection looks like self-erasure. And this is important because many women mistake these strategies for personality. I'm just highly driven. I'm just independent. I'm just caring. And perhaps there's truth in all of those things. But sometimes underneath them is also a strategy that stayed too long. A strategy that began as protection and slowly became identity. That's where we're going to go today, not into blame, into recognition. Because the moment you can see a pattern as protection, something begins to soften. And space is where choice begins to return. Protective strategies rarely feel protective while they're happening. They feel sensible, necessary, responsible. The woman moving into the Hermit doesn't think, I'm withdrawing because I feel unsafe. She thinks, I just need space. It's easier if I stay quiet on this. The woman moving towards the Tyrant doesn't think, I'm controlling this because I'm overloaded. She thinks, this needs to be done properly. I can't let this fall apart. The lone wolf thinks, it's easier if I just do this myself. The martyr thinks, they need me. I don't want to let anyone down. This is why shadow patterns become persuasive, because they arrive as logic, as competence, as care, as professionalism. And because these strategies are often rewarded, the nervous system learns, this works. This keeps me safe. This keeps me valuable. Over time, the body stops treating the strategy as temporary and it starts treating it as familiar. And familiarity feels true, even when it's exhausting. This is why insight alone rarely changes the protective response. You can understand the tyrant perfectly and still feel yourself tightening under pressure. You can recognise the martyr and still say yes automatically, because the body is not responding to logic in these moments. It's responding to remembered safety. And leadership activates these patterns powerfully, because leadership contains all the things that shape them in the first place. Visibility, responsibility, belonging, pressure, uncertainty, consequence. Leadership asks us to tolerate exposure, to tolerate complexity, to tolerate disappointing people sometimes. And if your nervous system learned early that any of these things carried risk, leadership will eventually activate the adaptation built to manage the risk. Not because you're weak, because your system is trying to help you survive pressure. This is why women can appear highly capable externally while feeling exhausted on the inside. The adaptation is working, but it consumes enormous energy to sustain it. The hermit uses energy disappearing. The tyrant uses energy maintaining control. The lone wolf uses energy carrying things internally. The martyr uses energy monitoring everybody else's emotional state. And over time, the woman slowly loses access to range. One response becomes the default. The adaptation stops feeling like strategy. It starts feeling like personality. I'm just introverted. I'm just highly driven. I'm just self-reliant. I'm just someone who cares deeply. But shadow patterns often hide inside identities that we've stopped questioning. And this is why self-judgment rarely helps. You can't shame your nervous system into flexibility. What begins changing things is recognition. The moment the woman begins to realise, this response makes sense, but it may no longer be the only response available to me. That's where movement begins. The shadows don't just shape behaviour, they shape interpretation. They begin telling us stories about what is true. And over time, those stories stop sounding like protection and start sounding like reality. The hermit begins believing it's safer not to put myself fully forward. Not always consciously. Sometimes it appears as hesitation, over-preparing, holding back ideas until they're fully formed, waiting until she feels completely ready before speaking. From the outside, the hermit often looks thoughtful, measured, careful, reserved. But underneath is usually a nervous system trying to avoid exposure, trying to avoid criticism, trying to avoid being overwhelmed. The Hermit learned long ago that visibility could become dangerous. So now she keeps herself safe by staying partially hidden, even if part of her wants to be seen. The Tyrant tells a different story. If I don't stay on top of this, things will fall apart. Again, this often looks highly functional externally. It looks organised, it looks efficient, high-performing, reliable. The Tyrant is frequently admired before she's understood, because she gets things done. But internally, there's very little room to breathe, very little room to trust, very little room to soften. The Tyrant learned that competence reduced risk, that staying ahead prevented pain, that being capable created safety. So under pressure, her nervous system moves automatically towards tightening. More oversight, more vigilance, more control. Not because she wants power over people, but because control feels safer than uncertainty. The lone wolf tells herself another story entirely. No one else sees what I see. The wise woman often learned early that she was perceptive. She was sensitive to complexity, sensitive to contradiction, and to undercurrents other people ignored. And over time, many wise women discovered that sharing these perceptions didn't always create connection. Sometimes it created misunderstanding or dismissal, isolation. So the lone wolf adapts by holding things internally. She holds the thinking, holds the strategy, holds the complexity. She becomes deeply self-reliant intellectually. And eventually, she starts believing that depending on others may create more work rather than less. So she carries, not because she believes she's superior, because she no longer fully trusts that others will meet her where she is. And the Martyr tells perhaps the most socially rewarded story of all. If everyone else is okay, then I can relax. The tribe builder learned early that relationships matter, that emotional harmony is important, that keeping connection intact matters. Often she became highly attuned to other people's moods, their needs, disappointments, and emotional states. She learned to anticipate, to smooth things over, to absorb, to accommodate. And because these behaviours are often praised in girls and women, the pattern can become almost invisible. The Martyr is rarely called selfish. She's called kind, supportive, reliable, thoughtful, generous. But internally, something else is happening. Her nervous system has become organised around other people's comfort, around other people's reactions, other people's emotional stability. And over time, she loses the ability to distinguish between compassion and responsibility. She begins carrying emotions that were never hers to carry. This is the thing I want listeners to notice today. The shadows are not random. Each one is trying to solve a specific problem. The Hermit protects against exposure. The Tyrant protects against failure and chaos. The lone wolf protects against disappointment and misunderstanding. And the Martyr protects against disconnection. And because these strategies work, the nervous system keeps reaching for them automatically, even when the environment has changed, even when the woman herself has changed. This is why shadow patterns feel so confusing. Part of you knows they're costing you something, and another part of you still experiences them as necessary. And over time, life begins organising itself around protection rather than possibility. The Hermit stops taking risks. The Tyrant stops trusting collaboration. The lone wolf stops sharing the internal load. The Martyr stops asking herself what she needs at all. And eventually women begin saying things like, I feel stuck. I feel tired all the time. I feel like I've lost myself somewhere. Not because they're broken, because their nervous system has been holding the same protective position for too long. At first, these strategies often feel effective. That's part of what makes them so difficult to recognise. The hermit avoids exposure. The tyrant maintains standards. The lone wolf keeps things moving. The martyr preserves connection. In the short term, each strategy solves something. But over time, the cost begins accumulating quietly. Not always in ways other people can immediately see. The woman living in the hermit may begin feeling increasingly disconnected from herself. Not peaceful, but absent. She stops bringing forward ideas before they're fully formed. She stops taking relational risk, stops allowing herself to be visible in unfinished ways. And eventually, leadership begins feeling like exposure management rather than expression. The tyrant pays a different cost. At first, control creates relief. The more tightly she manages things, the safer the system feels. But eventually, the vigilance becomes relentless. Everything feels important. Everything feels urgent. Everything feels like something that must be monitored, corrected, anticipated, and prevented. The nervous system never fully stands down. And after enough time living like that, even success stops feeling satisfying, because the body no longer experiences achievement as completion, only temporary reduction of the threat. The lone wolf often experiences the cost as heaviness, mental heaviness, emotional heaviness, the exhaustion of carrying too much internally for too long. She becomes the holder of complexity, the processor, the strategist, the translator, the influencer. And because she trusts herself more than the environment around her, she rarely lets the load redistribute properly. So the mind never fully rests. And the martyr's cost often appears as depletion, not only physical depletion, but relational depletion. She notices everyone else's exhaustion before her own, everyone else's disappointment before her own, everyone else's emotional needs before her own. And eventually caring stops feeling nourishing and it starts feeling compulsory. This is where many women begin feeling trapped inside lives that once made sense to them, not because the life itself is wrong, but because protection has become chronic. Leadership stops feeling expansive. It stops feeling creative or relational. And instead it begins feeling like management. Management of outcomes, management of perceptions, of emotional risk, of everyone else's reactions. And eventually, the nervous system begins narrowing in response. The hermit loses access to visibility. The tyrant loses access to softness. The lone wolf loses access to shared thinking. And the martyr loses access to self-prioritization. This is why many women begin feeling one-dimensional under chronic pressure. And it's not because they lack depth, but because only one part of them has been allowed to lead for too long. The woman who was once spontaneous becomes cautious. The woman who was once warm becomes guarded. The woman who was once energised by leadership begins quietly fantasising about disappearing from it altogether. And often this happens so gradually, they barely notice the shift while it's happening. Until one day, something catches their attention. A conversation, a reaction, an exhaustion that no longer feels sustainable, a sense that they've become emotionally smaller inside their own life. And somewhere inside, a thought appears. I don't think this is who I really am. That moment matters deeply because it's often the first sign that awareness is returning. Not awareness of behaviour yet, awareness of cost. The woman who calls herself high achieving starts recognising exhaustion. The woman who calls herself independent starts recognising isolation. The woman who calls herself easygoing starts recognising self-erasure. And once the nervous system begins understanding a pattern as protection rather than identity, something starts to loosen. A little space appears between the woman and the strategy. And inside that space, possibility begins returning. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about growth is the idea that we are trying to eliminate these patterns completely. Humans simply don't work that way. Pressure will still activate the old responses sometimes. There'll still be moments where the hermit wants to retreat, where the tyrant wants to tighten and control, where the lone wolf wants to carry everything internally herself, where the martyr wants to absorb everyone else's emotional experience. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is movement. It's range. The ability to notice the response without becoming fully consumed by it. That's a very different kind of leadership. The sovereign can stay visible without disappearing completely when uncertainty enters the room. The warrior can care deeply about standards without becoming consumed by vigilance. The wise woman can share insight without carrying the entire burden alone. The tribe builder can remain compassionate without abandoning herself in the process. This is what integration begins to look like. Not the absence of shadow, the gradual return of flexibility. The return of access to more than one version of yourself. Because healthy leadership is not one-dimensional. Healthy leadership moves, adapts. It responds. It allows different parts of the self to come forward in different moments. And that movement becomes impossible when the nervous system is locked into protection. Sometimes what we call personality is actually exhaustion organised into identity. That sentence lands hard for many women because suddenly they can see how much energy has gone into monitoring, controlling, carrying, pleasing, preparing, disappearing. But there's also relief in that recognition. Because if the pattern is adaptive rather than essential, then change becomes possible. Not forced change, safe change, gradual movement, the nervous system learning that new responses are survivable. The visibility doesn't always end in harm. The softness doesn't always create danger. That sharing the load doesn't always lead to disappointment. This is why awareness matters, not because awareness fixes everything immediately, but because awareness interrupts inevitability. The woman notices, I'm tightening again. I'm disappearing again. I'm carrying everyone again. And that noticing creates a profound interruption in the pattern. The nervous system begins realising there may be more than one possible response here. And that's where change begins. In possibility. As we come to the end of today's conversation, I want to slow this right down. Because when women begin recognising these patterns in themselves, the reflex is often self-criticism. They notice the withdrawal, the control, the over-functioning, the emotional exhaustion, and immediately they think, I need to stop doing this. But I don't think force is what's needed here. I think understanding is. Because none of the shadow archetypes were created to harm you. They were created to protect you. The hermit protected you from exposure. The tyrant protected you from uncertainty and failure. The lone wolf protected you from disappointment and misunderstanding. And the martyr protected you from disconnection. These strategies did not appear because you were weak. They appeared because your nervous system was intelligent, adaptive, and responsive. And somewhere along the way, the responses became familiar enough that they stopped feeling like strategies. They started feeling like self. But you were never only the protection. You were never only the withdrawal, only the control, only the self-sufficiency, only the overgiving. Those are responses, not your entirety. And if you're listening today and recognising yourself somewhere in these patterns, I want to gently remind you of something. Recognition is not failure. Recognition is awareness returning. The moment you can see the strategy, you're already beginning to loosen its hold. Not because insight alone changes everything, but because awareness interrupts inevitability. And from there, possibility begins opening again. If today's episode stirred recognition for you, the earlier episodes and explainer videos may help give some additional language and shape to these patterns. Not as labels, as lenses, as a way of understanding yourself with more compassion and more clarity. Because the goal of this work was never to make women smaller. It was to help you stop mistaking survival strategies for the full truth of who you are. And when protection softens, even slightly, something important begins happening. Power starts moving again. Not power as force or performance, but as flexibility, presence, and choice. A nervous system that no longer has to stay locked in one position all the time. That's where we're going next, toward leadership that can move again. Leadership that feels more spacious, more human, and more whole. I'm Ros Cardinal. This is the Archetype Effect. And sometimes the beginning of change is simply realising you are never only the protection. Thanks for joining me on the Archetype Effect. If this episode sparked an insight, share it with a woman who leads, or leave a review so more women can find these conversations. Until next time, lead with purpose and power that feels like you.